Okay, good evening, everybody. Shalom Aleichem, and thank you so much for joining me as we continue the second in our series of pre-Purim shiurim. Tonight, I'd like to begin by thanking our generous sponsors of tonight's shiur. First and foremost, tonight's shiur is being sponsored by Siriva and Jeff Sklar, commemorating the yahrzeit of Jeff's mother, Miriam Bas Yosef Chaim Eliezer. This year is also being sponsored by Molly Fish, commemorating the yahrzeits of her father, Shlomo ben Shalom Kohen, and her uncle, Gedalia Tzvi ben Shalom. And finally, this year is being generously sponsored by Raquel and Danny Haupt, Lezecha and Nishma Danny's mother, Barbara Haupt, Blima Fega Zochron Levracha. We thank them for their generous sponsorship and remind everybody that if you would like to sponsor shiurim in the future, please feel free at any time to reach out to the office at betheron.org, and we would be happy to make those arrangements. I would like to continue the conversation that we started last week. For those who were here, you may recall. For those who weren't, that's okay, because tonight is going to be a separate standalone topic. But for those who remember last week, we spent some time taking a look at the Megillah Esther, but in particular trying to uncover, reveal, if you will, some of the hidden aspects of the Megillah, the parts of the Megillah that perhaps we wouldn't necessarily notice on our own. Tonight we're going to do something different in the sense we're not really going to be studying Megillah Esther, but I do hope that in a similar fashion we will be able to discover some really, really very fascinating hidden gems, which will help us understand and appreciate to a greater degree Purim in general and what it is that we will be celebrating Be'ezras Hashem at the end of this week. So as we all know, Purim is of course called Purim, and Purim means lots. Specifically, it's a reference to the the lots that were drawn, as the Megillah describes, in order to determine when exactly Haman will be able to carry out his plot and annihilate the Jewish people. So on that concept, the concept of the lot, this system that was used. So the Gemara in Megillah on Daf Yud Gimel and Beis, which is found on the first source on the page that you hopefully see before you, Hipil Pur Hu Hagoro, right? It says in the Megillah that Haman drew lots, Tana, and it says that Kevan Shenafal Pur B'Chodesh Adar Samach Simcha Gedola. When Haman realized that the lots fell on the month of Adar, right? He did not know exactly when it would be determined, as far as he knows completely by chance, when it will be that he will be able to carry out his decree to kill the Jews. So once he discovered that it happened in the month of Adar, that was the month that was selected, seemingly by chance, he was thrilled. He was so happy. He said, "Nafali pur b'yerach shemeis bo Moshe." Look, just my luck. It just happens that by chance it fell in the exact month that Moshe Rabbeinu, the great savior, the leader of the Jewish people, the month in which he died. And so Haman, I guess he knew some aspects of Jewish history. He knew who Moshe Rabbeinu was. He knew when Moshe Rabbeinu died. And so therefore he celebrates, knowing that the Jewish people are going to be destroyed in that very same month. Pashup Shat seems to be that he assumed that this was already a time of disfortune, of maybe from his perspective, sort of like an auspicious time when there would be a lack of fortune and luck for the Jewish people. However, continues the Gemara v'lo yodea shebeshiva ba'adar meis ubeshiva ba'adar nolad. But Haman didn't know all of his Jewish history, because whereas he knew that Moshe Rabbeinu died in the month of Adar, he did not know that he was also born in the month of Adar. Not only in the month, but specifically the 7th of the month. The day of Moshe's birthday is also the day of his yahrzeit, right? The 7th day of the month of Adar. So here you have a very interesting Gemara, which basically tells us that Haman was excited. He was thrilled to discover that the Jews were going to be killed in Adar, but he didn't realize that it wasn't as simple as he assumed, because Moshe was also born in the month of Adar. Now, other than the fact that this seems to be an interesting coincidence, if you will, that Moshe was born and died on the same day, it's far from clear to us what is the deeper message over here. What is the idea that Chazal are trying to convey? Why is it that Haman was so happy? And why is it that we realize that he was wrong by not really appreciating how the month of Adar also is sort of a positive, a good month, because after all, Moshe was born in the month of Adar. This is something that hopefully we'll be able to achieve greater clarity in a few minutes. The next source I want to share with you is a medrash. The medrash over here in Esther Rabbah teaches that when the decree was ordered that the Jews are going to be killed, so letters, as we know, were sent all over the various provinces of Achashverosh. The edict was signed and basically broadcast for everybody to see. Lashmir, la'aroges, kol ha'Yehudim shebenechem minari adzakin taf v'nashim b'yom echad. The decree to annihilate, to kill the entire Jewish people, men, women, children, everybody on one day. And there should be no survivors. At the time that these letters were finalized, were sealed, and given over to Haman, he was happy, says the Medrash. He was thrilled. And it just so happened at that moment, he encounters Mordechai, who is walking before them. And what does he see? That Mordechai goes over to 3 school children who are leaving Beis HaSefer, they are leaving school. V'ratz Mordechai achareim, and Mordechai is running after them. When Haman sees this, that Mordechai is running after these kids, so he as well follows Mordechai. Ladas ma'yishal Mordechai. He wants to know what's Mordechai going to ask them. Why is he going after these kids? So Kevin Shigi Mordechai Yesli Tinokos Shalach Mihem Psokli Psukech. When Mordechai reaches up with the first one of the children, he asks them a very strange question. He says, literally, tell me your pasuk. But what he's saying is, tell me what you learned in yeshiva today. What did you learn in school? Now, before we go on in the Medrash, I want to share with you in source number 4 over here, a very interesting idea, which is found over here in the footnotes in the Sefer Kol Eliyahu, that he brings down from the Toras Chaim Masechus Bava Basra, who explains that we find there are other occasions as well where Chazal tell us that there were Chachamim who used to inquire. They used to go over to children and say, what pasuk are you learning? What did you learn in school that day? And why would they do this? They did this as a way of getting a little bit of an insight into the future. They wanted to know what the future holds. How does this work? After all, it sounds a little bit shady. This sounds like some sort of witchcraft of sort. What is this? Where you're going to go ahead and ask kids? Why should that matter? So the Gemara tells us that at the time of the Churban Beis Hamikdash, there was no longer any prophecy. The prophets who had prophesied, we have many of their prophecies that are recorded in the Sifrei Nevi'im. So at that point, there was a suspension of prophecy in the world. However, it was still transmitted. It was given to the Tinokos. Even though the Nevi'im, the prophets, would no longer be able to communicate messages, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to communicate messages to the world, he does so through children. In what sense? Not that every time a child says something, they are necessarily speaking as a prophet, but the idea over here, as explained over here, is that when a child is learning Torah, so the Torah that the child is learning has a way to convey a certain message. Now, I'm not sure that this is so simple that anybody could just go ahead, when your child comes home from school, so what you learned today, and whatever pasuk they learned is somehow going to tell you about what's going to be in the future. It's not so simple. It doesn't work that way. But clearly, what Chazal are saying over here is that Mordechai, who obviously himself was an individual who was Zocha to Ruach HaKodesh, an individual who was on himself a very high level, he was able to go ahead and to tap into this frequency, if you will, by asking these kids, so what you learn? So he goes over to the first child and he said, Psokli Psukech, tell me, what you learn today? And he quotes a pasuk from Mishlei. The pasuk is found over here at the Medrash, but it's found over here in source number 3. Al tira mipachat pisom umishoas rishoim kisavo. Some of you may be familiar with this pasuk. Some have the custom of saying this, and actually the next 2 pasukim as well after Aleinu at the end of davening. Al tira mipachat pisom means do not be afraid from a sudden terror. Umishoas rishoim kisavo, and do not be afraid of the impending destruction of evil people. Continues the Medrash. He goes over to the next child and he says, what did you learn today? And this child says, and he quotes a different pasuk from Yeshayahu. It's found over here also in source number 3. Utsu eitza v'sufar dabru davar v'lo yakum ki imanu kil. That when our enemies conspire against us and they plot and they make plans to our destruction, they could plot all they want. They could plan all they want, but it's not going to make a difference. It will not have a kiyum ki imanu el, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with us. And the third child said, and he quotes the final pasuk that you see in source number 3, Va'ad zikna anihu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, until I am old, so to speak, I am who I am. Va'ad seva. And even in my days of my elderly years, right? Seva means an old person, ani esbo. I will continue to sustain and to carry the Jewish people. Ani asisi, I made them. Va'ani esa, and I carry them. Va'ani espol, and I sustain them. Va'amalet, and I will protect them. So here Mordechai approaches 3 school children, and each one of them tells Mordechai a different pasuk. Al tiram mipachad pisom, utzaweis of asufa, va'zik nanihu. When Mordechai hears this, continues the Medrash, Kevin Shashama Mordechai Kach, when he hears this, he's thrilled, he's happy, he rejoices. Haman looks at him, he says, what are you so happy about? So Mordechai says, I'm happy, I'm so happy the kids have given me wonderful news. I'm so happy that I don't have to be afraid of this terrible plan that you have plotted against us. How do you think Haman reacts? Predictably, he gets angry, and he says, yeah. And then he says, I'm going to go after those children first. So Haman, in his typical style, is angry. He's disgruntled. He has no interest in Mordechai's beliefs. And he says to Mordechai, you can laugh all you want right now, but I'm coming after you. I'm coming after your people, and I'm going to go for those children first. So here you have a very strange medrash. I mean, on the surface, again, it's very fascinating and interesting. I just explained some of the background. The Mordechai thinks that he can get some sort of inkling, some insight into the future. But still, what's going on over here? What is the significance of these 3 psukim? So now take a look at the 5th source on the page. This comes from the Sefer Kol Eliyahu, which is a collection of various teachings of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, and his interpretation of different Agados and Chazal. So here you have this medrash, which again tells us, strangely, these 3 psukim, and the Gra explains it so beautifully. He says, Mishum dematzinu, we find shalosh pa'amim sheba Amalek yimach shemama Yisrael. We find there were 3 times in history when Amalek confronts and attacks the Jewish people. The first one we're going to read about on Purim, we just read several weeks ago in Parshas Shavua, Parshas Beshalach. It says, Vayavo Amalek vayilachem Yisrael b'refidim. That Amalek came, they approached the Jewish people, and they waged the war against them, b'refidim. Upamashnia. The second incident is found in Parshas Chukas. When Aaron dies, it says, Vayishma Knani melech Arad Yoshev HaNegev ki ba Yisrael derech Yisanim vayilachem Yisrael. Over there it says the Knanim, it doesn't say Amalekim. They were dwelling in the south, and they fought against the Jewish people. But the Medrash tells us, and this is brought down in Rashi and Chumash, that actually was Amalek. And the reason why they appear as Canaanim is because they changed their language. They adjusted their accent a little bit to appear as if they were Canaanim. And this way, when the Jewish people felt threatened, and they would daven, Hashem, save us from the Canaanim. But they weren't Canaanim, they were really Amalekim. And this way, their tefillos won't work. But Bnei Yisrael suspected that something was up, because while it's true that they sounded like Canaanim, they dressed like Amalekim, they didn't know. And so therefore they daven stam, as it says in Nason Titenes Amazeh Biyadi. And basically the Medrash tells us that this is the second time that the Jewish people were attacked by Amalek. Upam Shlishi, the third event in history, is Haman Yimach Shemo. Haman, who we're going to read about, of course, on Purim, who was, of course, a descendant of Amalek, was the third incident in history. And now says the Gra, Va'al shalosh pa'amim elu ramzalo Mordechai hatinokos b'nevuasei maktanos. In these little miniature, if you will, nevuos, these mini prophecies of these children, as they were communicated to Mordechai, Mordechai saw a remez to these 3 moments in history. Ha'echa, the first child said to him, Altira mi pachad pisom. Don't be afraid when there is a sudden terror. And this was a remez to the first time in history when Amalek attacked the Jewish people. They attacked them suddenly. Peta pisom was suddenly. And there was no warning that they were coming. And what happens? The Torah tells us, we just read this past week, Parsha Zachar, Asher korcha baderech, that they came pisom derech mikra. And of course, Bnei Yisrael were caught off guard. They had no time to prepare. They were not ready for this. And yet what happened? HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved them. Altira mipachad pisom mishoas rishayim kisavo. Hasheni, the second time in history we saw when the Canaanim disguised themselves as if they were Amalek disguised himself as if they were Canaanim. Omra lo, the pasuk says, Utsu eitza v'sufar, that they conspired, they came up with a plan, a plot to fool the Jewish people. She hischakmu uz v'siyatzu l'daber b'lashon Canaan. V'lirmos Israel, they try to fool the people so they wouldn't recognize them. U'b'chozos hatzilenu Hashem miyadim. Nevertheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu rescues them. V'hufrat sasam ken yoshienu gam atom miyado. HaKadosh Baruch Hu thwarts their plan. So too it should be in the future as well that God will save us from Amalek. Vatino kashlishi, the third child says to Mordechai, Va'adzikna anihu va'adseva ani ezbo. This is a reference to Haman, who said about HaKadosh Baruch Hu shekvar hizkin. Haman was a funny guy. Says the Medrash, he says about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he's old. What does that mean? What happened was, at the time that Haman decides that he's going to eradicate the Jewish people, so the Chachmei Olam, the wise people of the day, came to Haman and they said, listen up, buddy. It's not so simple. Take a look what happened. You think you're the first person to try to kill these people? Others have tried. Paro, Sancherev, and they failed. They failed miserably. Their God is a very, very strong God. He can perform these incredible miracles. He destroyed Mitzrayim, the Makos, Kriyas Yamsuf. He killed Sancherev's entire army in one night. So they were basically warning Haman, stay away from the Jews. Not good. Miyad Amalo Haman. Haman said, Elokim shetava lapara b'yam v'asli yisrael nisma gvuros. This God that you're talking about, who performed all these miracles on behalf of the Jewish people, kvar hu zaken. He said he's old. He's an old man. Ve'ena yochel lasos klum. He can't do anything. And Haman says, I'll prove it. You know how you know he can't do anything? Look, his house was destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar just came. What was it? Less than 100 years earlier, and destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. God's house, the temple, is gone. Where is God's might? Where's his power? Elamai says, his kin. He's old. So Haman says, I got nothing to worry about. These people, they got nothing on me. Their God, he's old, he's weak. L'chein Omar, so the Tino Kashlishi says, Va'adzikna anihu. God says, even in my days of my elder years, when I'm a zaken, anihu, I am the same God. Even though they say about me that I'm old, he says, don't worry, I haven't lost anything. I don't change. I don't get old. I will save you. And that's why Mordechai is rejoicing. Mordechai is happy because Mordechai realizes that through these tinokos, he's being told, don't worry. Haman sounds like he's a big threat. Don't worry, nothing's going to happen. What does this mean? That Haman said that God is old? How can we understand that perhaps on a little bit of a deeper level? So in the Sefer Torah Ladas, which was written by Rav Matisyahu Blum, Zechron Levracha, who passed away a little less than a year ago. Rav Blum was one of the first Gedolim from our community to succumb to the coronavirus. I think it was really in the first few weeks of this terrible pandemic that Rabbi Blum was taken from us. He was a Rav for many years in Queens, taught in shul, taught in many yeshivos, and he has a very, very impressive set of Sfarim called Torah Ladas, which has many halachic discussions and some drushos as well. And he writes there, this idea that Haman says that God got old. Pirshu HaMefarshim, the Mefarshim explain, the Ratzon Ulama, what he means is that we find that God now operates in the world through the natural order. He says, just like an older person who walks a little slower, he can't necessarily jump and run, and he can't go sort of above and beyond his normal, natural, limited constraints. So too God, from Haman's perspective, had sort of reached this point where he was no longer able to perform great miracles. He was just operating b'derech hateva through nature. He was no longer doing miracles like he used to. The Ikra and Haganisis Rak b'mei Moshe. Haman reasoned, we only see great miracles when Moshe Rabbeinu was alive. But now that they've been sent into exile, we don't see such miracles. What Haman did not realize is Ki Yisrael Tamid Omdim Tachas Hashgachas Hashem, that the Jewish people are always under God's watch. As it says, as the pasuk says, that even it's true when you're sent away, and even when you're in foreign lands, I have not turned myself completely. I don't despise you. I always perform miracles. Sometimes they are galuyim, sometimes they are what we call supernatural miracles, and sometimes they are happening within the limits of nature. And now we could understand what the Gemara was saying earlier. The Gemara says that when Haman saw that the lots fell in the month of Adar, he was so happy. He saw that it fell in the very month that Moshe died. And then the Gemara says, but he didn't realize that Moshe was also born there. What does that mean? Haman was happy because he said, I am going to destroy the Jewish people in the very month in which Moshe died, meaning the time in history when God again lost his power to perform miracles. The imisaso paska hanaganisis, says Haman, as far as I could tell, when Moshe Rabbeinu died, so too did this concept of God performing supernatural miracles. As the pasuk says at the end of Chumash, Moshe Rabbeinu facilitated. He was the one. He seemed to be almost like God's intermediary, his instrument that God used to go ahead and to perform all these miracles. And now Haman says, that's my chance. Look, God's old. He no longer performs his miracles. And look, just my luck. It falls in the month of Adar. Avalo Yada, says the Gemara, he didn't realize that Moshe Rabbeinu was also born in the month of Adar. B'shiva ba'adar meis, or b'shiva ba'adar nolad. What does that mean? He says that when Moshe Rabbeinu died, we still find that there are nisim. The Torah tells us about Moshe lo chasa eino v'lo naslecho, that Moshe did not age in the way that people naturally do. Vayikbaro Sobagai, Moshe was buried. Who buried Moshe? Either HaKadosh Baruch Hu buried Moshe, or according to one opinion, Moshe buried himself. Either way, that's what we would call a miracle. But on the other hand, when Moshe was born, we saw everything was happening up Hidar Chateva. What happened? A man met a woman, they got married. All the baby boys were being thrown into the water, not Moshe. His mother makes a little basket. She places him on the edge of the water. Even then, God does not send a malach. Bas Paro herself sees the basket, pulls it close. You know the story. All of these nisim are muluvashim beteva. They are all within the natural order. V'zo hayasatos Haman. This was Haman's great error. Shelo yada, he did not realize, he did not appreciate that even though Moshe Rabbeinu died in the month of Adar, and it's true, on a certain level, from his perspective, Pascha and Haga Nisis, Mikoma Kom B'Shiva Ba'Adar Nolad, Moshe was born in Adar as well, which means that Afilu Kasher B'nei Yisrael Nohugim B'derech HaTeva, even when HaKadosh Baruch Hu operates within Teva, as happened at the time Moshe was born, Tamid Eni Hashem Pekucha Salama Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always there. He was always watching. He's always Mashkiach Aleinu. Sometimes it is B'derech Nisim Gluyim, and sometimes it is Nisim Nistarim. Sometimes it is what we call a Malam in Teva, and sometimes it is through Teva. Even if we're not necessarily doing all we should do, this is only the face God shows us. Right? We saw this last week. Esther min Torah minayim. Where do we find Esther in the Torah? And the pasuk says, Anochi haster astir panai. Bayom ahu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I will hide, I will conceal my face from them. We explained last week that means HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't say, that's it, I'm done, I'm gone, I'm leaving, you're never going to see me again. He's saying, I'm hidden. I'm hidden in Teva. You're going to have to work a little harder to see me. He goes on to quote from the Baal Aruch HaShulchan, who explains based on this, that's why we learn, the Medrash tells us based on a pasuk at the end of Megillah Esther that says, which means literally that Purim will never fail to be observed within the Jewish people, with the Jewish community. that Chazal say something very strange, that even if all the other Moadim, all the other holidays, the other festivals will be B'Telim, Yimei Purim lo yivatlu. What does that mean? So what that means is, it's true. There are other festivals, there are other holidays that we celebrate, Yetzias Mitzrayim, Matan Torah, Nani HaKavod, Besukos. These are all Nisim Gluyim. However, there are points in history in which we don't see, we don't appreciate, we can't recognize, we're not zocha to have Nisim Gluyim. However, the Nes of Purim, Hayakol in Yonu B'derech HaTeva, Ba'ofen Shemisha Libo Cholak Me'amunas Hashem Yochel Lefarish HaKol B'derech HaTeva, V'zer She'amar, Im Nisim Gluyim, K'mol B'chol HaMoadim Yufsaku, even if there'll be no way to notice, to recognize, to see Nisim Gluyim, but the Nisim that are Kamusim Atunim B'darchei HaTeva, the Nisim that are embedded within nature, La'olam lo yivutlu. Those will never be abolished. In every generation, we can always see the Yad Hashem. We just need to look for it. And so therefore, the idea of the eternity, the eternal legacy of Purim is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always there. He's always in Teva. Haman's great mistake was that he thought he hit the jackpot. He thought he got lucky because here, look, what are the chances? The lots fell in the month of Adar, and that's the time where God, so to speak, loses his ability to intercede, to come and to save the Jewish people. But that's only one part of the story. HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a decision at a certain point to no longer operate, no longer function, in which he facilitates the Nisim, the Malam Teva, but B'toch HaTeva. So that's something that continues even beyond that point. That's the secret of the 7th of Adar, the day in which Moshe was born, not only the day in which he died. Now, if you hear this last source that you have on the page, I'm actually not going to read it all inside right now because I want to do something else with you. But 2 points I want to highlight on here. The first one is, the Gemara tells us that when it comes to Megillas Esther, Hakorei L'Mafreya Lo Yatza, that if a person reads the Megillah out of order, let's say a person comes late to shul and they hear the end of the reading, let's say they hear the second half of the Megillah, and they stick around for the second reading, and they hear the first half of the Megillah. So this way they heard everything. It was just out of order. Normally you start from the beginning, you go to the end. Over here the guy started from the end, then he goes to the beginning. So Chazal say you're not Yotze. Why not? So he suggests, this is an idea that is found in other sources as well, that if a person really, really wants to appreciate the Purim story, so you have to, first of all, you have to read the story, and you have to read it in order. Because as we pointed out last week, there is nothing really extraordinary. There's nothing exceptional that occurs. There's nothing truly remarkable. There's nothing that is Lamalam and Ateva. Even from the perspective of our appreciation of the divine, God's name is not found anywhere in Megillas Esther. It's unique in that regard. It's the only one of the Sifrei Tanakh in which Hashem's name is not mentioned. And so to the casual observer, to a person who's just sort of like, just reading it sounds like an interesting story, maybe a little dramatic, a little intriguing, but really it's not really all that remarkable. But with a little more focus, starting from the beginning and following every step along the way and seeing how all the different parts and pieces fit together and appreciating the sequence of those events. So what emerges is a glorious, glorious picture, a picture that many of us can say, this is Takanes. This is miraculous. It was miraculous. It's like Kriyas Yamsuf. It's not like Kriyas Yamsuf, but it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu guiding the entire story within the confines of Teva, which is something that in some ways can actually be even more enthralling. When you live in a world in which there are Nisim Gluyim, there's a limit. There aren't Nisim Gluyim every day by definition. Otherwise, it wouldn't be supernatural. Then it would be natural. So even those who are zocha to see a Nes Nigla, what do you see a Nes Nigla? What, once in your life? After all, think about Bnei Yisrael Mitzrayim. So they had a period of time where they saw the Makos and Kriyas Yamsuf. And it's true, that was an extended period. There were Nisim Gluyim in the Midbar 40 years. But generally, by and large, these moments, they happen very sporadically. Teva is something that we encounter each and every day. And for the discerning eye, for a person who's looking, for a person who's searching to discover HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world, we can see HaKadosh Baruch Hu in every day through the Teva. And he explains as well, over here he's talking about the difference between Chanukah and Purim, and he basically makes this point. He says, Chanukah, which again is the time in which we recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu as being the one who facilitates Nisim Gluyim. So that is an important message, but it's not really one that can sustain us through the Gullus. Because the Gullus, by and large, is a period of time in which we don't see God's revealed face. It's a period of Vanochi Aster Panai Bayomahu. It's HaKadosh Baruch Hu again hiding his face. But the Nisim Nistarim, the idea of seeing HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Teva, so this is something which is again sort of an eternal experience, not something which is limited to any particular time in history. I'd like to switch gears for one moment and to talk about a little more this idea that we've been discussing, but to go in a little bit of a different direction. And we're going to come back to where we started. I want to focus for a few minutes on the Purim story. And I want to make a point, which is a very practical one, because everything that we've discussed until now, while I hope you found it to be inspiring and interesting and enlightening, I'm not sure that it necessarily leaves us with anything practical, no real practical takeaways. But I do believe that there's a very, very important practical message that we can draw from this whole concept of comparing Nisim Gluyim and Nisim that are B'toch HaTeva. So let's focus for a few minutes on the Purim story. Now, the Megillah paints a very powerful illustration of Shushan. And there's a certain theme, there's a certain topic that recurs again and again throughout the Megillah, and that is the concept of feasts, parties, Mishta. In fact, the reason why we have a special mitzvah to have a Sudas Purim is, at least one of the reasons, to commemorate the fact that the Mishta, the Su'udos, there were numerous ones throughout the story, were such an essential, such a central part of the story. The word Mishta appears 40 times in Tanakh, 20 of which are in Megillah Esther. So if you want to just get a sense over here, the word Mishta, we've heard it elsewhere, but half of the times that the word appears in all of Tanakh and Megillah Esther. So it's obviously a very, very prominent theme throughout the Megillah. Party after party after party. Shushan, the capital city, is the original city that never sleeps. And what kind of parties did they throw in Shushan? Big parties. How long did they last? 6 months. Can you imagine? Big parties. Now, what kind of parties were them? Well, we know, first of all, there was lots of drinking. And what did they serve? They serve whatever you want. Lasos, kirtzon, ish va'ish. Whatever you like. Scotch, vodka, red wine, white wine. You don't want to drink it all? Hashisiya kedas eino nes. Nobody's forced to drink. Whatever you taste, we have it. V'kelim shonim. Very open, liberal society. No offending anybody. Anything goes. And in this society, which ideal reigns supreme? What is perhaps the most important ideal and the universal value, which is at the core of the city of Shushan? And the answer, of course, is money. Those who have money climb the social ladder, and those who don't. Haman climbed his way to the top. He bought his way to the top. By the way, so did Achashverosh, Chazal tell us. They both paid their way because this society worships its wealth. So the Shushan parties revolve completely around money and materialism, physical pleasure, pure hedonism, a self-indulging, pleasure-seeking society. Chur, karpasus, acheles, achuz bechavli butz, v'argamon al galile kesef, amudi sheish, mitoz zahav v'chesav ha'ritzpaz bahat v'sheish v'dar v'sochares. Where does all this money come from? Who foots the bill for all of these extravagant feasts? And the answer, of course, is the poor. As we know from the Megillah, but Chazal elaborate, there was heavy taxation. They party in the backs of the lower class. After all, somebody has to pay for it. And this was the story, basically, of Shushan Habira. This is the society in which the Jews found themselves some 2,500 years ago. Now, let me ask you, did they belong there? Is this a place for a nice Jewish boy or girl? So the answer is, of course, not. This is not where they belong. And there's more. The type of partying that went on, the way that they displayed and conducted themselves publicly, no shame whatsoever. The partying took place in open, b'chatzar ginas ha'melech. Nothing was restricted. King Achashverosh calls Vashti, and the demands that she appear before everyone to see how beautiful she is. Now, that's the story that we read in the Megillah, and that's the story that we tell our children. The Gemara in Megillah Daf Yud Beis gives us the, if you will, the uncensored version, and it's frankly a horrifying thought. But I have to share with you. Chazal tell us that Achashverosh is drunk at his party, and there's a big debate that's taking place as to which women are more beautiful, the women that come from Madai or the women that come from Persia. And they're having this big debate. A bunch of drunk men just having this discussion. So Achashverosh stands up and he says, Kli she'ani mishtamish bo. You'll forgive me. I hope I'm not offending anybody. He says, the vessel that I use, Eino lo Madai velo Parsi lo Kazdi. He says she's not from Madai and she's not from Parsi. She's not a Persian. He says, Ritzon Cham Larosa. He says, you want to see her? And they say, Inu bavachite aruma. Yes, but she has to appear before us without her clothes on. Just listen to this animal speak, a complete cheapening of anything that is honorable and special. Where's the dignity, the honor, the respect? And it doesn't end there. The selection process is not exactly as we were taught in second grade. What does the Megillah tell us? Be'erev hi ba'a uvaboker hi shava. She came in the evening, she leaves in the morning. The Megillah doesn't lower itself to be more explicit than that, but make no mistake about what it means. This is Shushan. Nothing is private. Nothing is sacred. There is no sense of busha. There is no sense of tznius. A society which is completely morally bankrupt. The Gemara asks, why were Bnei Yisrael punished? What did they do to deserve almost being annihilated by Haman? And Chazal are very, very clear. You know what they did wrong? Well, first Chazal tell us what they didn't do wrong. It's not because they were eating non-kosher food. The food was kosher l'mahadrin. Not only that, the Gemara tells us that one of the ways that Haman was able to get Achashverosh to realize that the Jews may be a problem is you see how the makbid they were in Yayin Nesech. They wouldn't touch the wine if any one of Achashverosh's people touched it. So, of course, they walked on Shabbos. I'm sure everything was 100% glatt. They probably had a daf yomi shir after the cocktails. So what did they do wrong? So Chazal tell us, Mibnei shenenu misudaso shaloso arasha. They went to the parties. They got benefit from these parties. And what Chazal are saying is you want to know what they did? They were there. How could they go? How could they just sit there for 180 days? What about their Jewish values? Where was their sense of tznius? Didn't anything make them blush? Of course, it's okay for leisure and vacation, but not this. And even if they weren't actively participating in that which was most offensive, the Gemara Yevamos tells us that there are certain signs, characteristics of the Jewish people. Shlosha simanim yesh ba'uma zu, rachmanim baishanim gomlei chasadim. Compassion, people who are committed to acts of loving kindness, and baishanim. Baishanim doesn't mean that we are embarrassed. It means that there's a certain level of modesty. There are things in the world that make us blush. This is part of who we are, and it is part of who we should aspire to be. Now, Chazal tell us that Esther Hamalka was a descendant of Shaul, who was a descendant of Binyamin, who was a descendant of Rachel. And Rachel displayed tznius, and Shaul displayed tznius. And Esther also, Ein Esther Mageres Molaratavi Asama. Her very name expresses this idea. She was hidden, she was private. She possessed a lot more than she showed. Of course, she had beauty and she had depth. She had much to share, but she did not flaunt. For Esther, everything was hidden. And the tragic irony is that in order to save her generation, she had to make the ultimate sacrifice. She had to lower herself and go against her nature to live with that animal Achashverosh. Yes, Esther also throws parties. However, her parties have purpose. They're goal-oriented. She makes her parties, but before she does so, she fasts. First with tshuva, and then tefillah, and then the parties. Her parties don't take place b'chatzar ginas hamelech. Rather, they take place beveis hamelech, in private. This was her way. Esther exemplified tznius, which is an attitude, an orientation which is so basic and fundamental for every Jew, man and woman alike. The Navi tells us, what is good for man? What does God want from us? That we should pursue justice, we should pursue kindness, and we should walk tznius, humbly with God. This is obviously not a reference to dress. Means something which is much more subtle, much more sublime than the way we dress. Now, what does this have to do with everything that we were doing in the first half of this year? I want to share with you a beautiful idea that I once heard. I believe I heard this in the name of the Maral, but I didn't do my homework to look it up beforehand, so I'll have to Blina to do it afterwards. We know that we are to emulate the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Torah tells us, "V'alachta b'drachav," we are to emulate Hashem. Now, where is the midah of tznius found by HaKadosh Baruch Hu? It's an interesting question. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is compassionate. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is kind. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does lots of wonderful things. He sustains us. He provides for us. So these are all midos that we see. Where do we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is modest? Where do we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu displays himself with tznius? So apparently, the Maharal suggests, you know where you see that? You see that within Teva, within nature. We know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is fully capable of performing Nisim Gluyim, but he doesn't. He doesn't. That's not what Purim is about. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name is nowhere in the Megillah. He's teaching the Jews of Shushan that just because you have something doesn't mean it needs to be flaunted and shared with the rest of the world. That's not our way. The Aron, which we just read about last week in Parshas Shuma, which is a centerpiece of the Mishkan, is placed lifnai v'lifnim. It is hidden. It is off limits. Dafka, that which has the greatest holiness, is covered and it's hidden. Perhaps, who knows, maybe that's why there's a custom to get dressed up on Purim. I don't know. So the idea is, we started off by saying that the miracle of Purim is one which in certain ways is sort of superior, above and beyond, but certainly fundamentally different than that of Hanukkah and that of perhaps the other Yom Tovim, when we celebrate HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Hanhagas Nisis, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Hashgacha in the world in which he operates Lamala Min HaTeva. And in the Purim story, we see how HaKadosh Baruch Hu is also in charge, even when things are operating in accordance with the laws of nature. And whereas Haman didn't see that, he didn't appreciate it, he thought that he had his chance to destroy the Jewish people. And Mordechai goes over to this child and says, tell me what you learned. And he says, Ani zikna, bani zikna anihu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, even when I appear old, even when it seems that I've lost my edge, that I can no longer operate Lamalim and Teva, and I am only operating within the realm of Teva, you should know Ani Hu. Ani Hashem lo shanisi. Ani esbov, ani amalet. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I will carry you, I will sustain you, I will protect you, I will save you, even Besoch HaTeva. And I'm suggesting that the entire Purim story is a reminder. It is a reminder. We are able to compare and to contrast the hedonistic, disgusting, and grotesque value system of the people of ancient Shushan, the people who Bnei Yisrael associated themselves with, the Yehudim, the Jews who lived there, were comfortable for some reason being part of that, even if they were just as bystanders. And for that alone, says the Gemara in Megillah, they almost faced annihilation. And we were saved by a team of individuals, if you will, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Mordechai, Esther, who all demonstrated by example the koach of tznius, the ability to go ahead to remind ourselves that even Besoch HaHester, even Besoch HaTeva, even when things are operating in the natural order and things are not being flaunted and things are not being and things are not being done in a way which is meant to capture one's attention. So even there, if not especially there, where you're able to realize and to recognize our potential to become individuals who live up to our potential, as the Gemara tells us, that we, the Jewish people, are to be by shanim. And hopefully, if we can try to exemplify this trait, if we could try to become individuals who can truly operate within this realm of tznius, so then we will be emulating HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who conducts himself in a tzanua way through Teva. And that's what it means, v'hatznei aleches im Elokecha, to walk humbly with God. HaKadosh Baruch Hu walks, so to speak, through this world, but in a natural way. He doesn't flaunt himself. We should emulate him. We should try to do the same. Be'ezras Hashem, if we can be inspired to remember the importance of these values, if we can try to connect with them and to exemplify them and to practice them and to integrate them into our life all throughout the year, but especially right now as we are preparing to celebrate the Yom Tov of Purim, so hopefully we will be zocheh in our day to witness the fulfillment of the words La Yehudim ha'yisa'ora v'simcha v'sasan vikar. As we're going to read in the Megillah, the Jewish people were zocheh to ora simcha v'sasan vikar, and as we say when we say Havdalah and Motzei Shabbos, Kain Tialanu. May we be zocheh to experience miracles, true miracles. For Misha Asa Nisim, Lavosenu Bayam Mahem, Bazman hazeh. Thank you, and a good night and a Purim Sameach to all.